I was struck by a nostalgic sensation while playing The Last Guardian. Beyond the cozy familiarity of its pacing, puzzle design, and technical mishaps, existed this notion of expanse. My early impression of video games was fraught with such unfamiliarity that it seemed impossible to grasp the scope and depth of each experience. As I grew more accustomed to the medium, I began to feel anxious when I noticed the seams and tropes that maintained that mystical illusion. Fumito Ueda's latest game returned to me that lost sense of wonder. It did not accomplish this because it is seamless or above the medium's tropes. Rather, The Last Guardian triumphs in defiance of these elements. As the product of an auteur, there is no escape for The Last Guardian from comparison to its peers. The game is marked as a merging of disparate concepts. Shadow of the Colossus's stark transitions from bleak wanderlust to immense encounters become bursts of intensity woven intrinsically into the puzzle-solving and linear exploration of The Last Guardian. Ico's juxtaposition of intimacy and respite and anxiety and conflict are combined to form a relationship that reinforces affinity in combat by granting valuable roles to both the boy and the creature. Meanwhile, the restful moments become fraught with tension upon realizing the toll that the last encounter has taken upon the player's companion. Chief among these compositions is how the primary mechanics of both Last Guardian's predecessors blend to make an engrossing and unique hook. Players rely on their companion, Trico, to further their exploration. Rather than limit this to Ico's asymmetrical cooperation, the game asks that players engage with Trico to solve its puzzles. They do this by climbing on the creature, making careful dismounts, and daring grasps to clamber back on. Unlike the combative goal of Shadow of the Colossus, this platforming serves to further test and enforce the relationship between the player and Trico. The Last Guardian's connecting of Ueda's previous design concepts indicates an intense reflection on those tenets. In this retrospection, he has sought to undo the principles of his repertoire. The cathartic removal of the spears from Trico's body attempts to mend the penetrative wounds inflicted on the mournful colossi, whereas Shadow of the Colossus depicts the tragic results of an unwillingness to stop and foster understanding. The Last Guardian confronts players with the difficult task of connecting with its monster. This is a controversial inversion. An AI that doesn't immediately conform to player input and expectations is often a root of frustration. Many will simply lack the patience to appreciate that the destination is less important than the goal of achieving that connection. Thus, player progression is halted when they aren't properly communicating with Trico. Ico didn't need to concern itself with communication. Getting that game's companion to a desired location meant simply pulling her to it. Ico's pathos parallels that of The Last Guardian. Players are expected to form an invested relationship with an AI companion. As if desiring to grant the young girl Yorda the same agency as the plucky Ico, players are now the ones escorted throughout the mysterious ruins in Ueda's latest game. The player's ability to hold hands and snuggle up with the cute, defenseless Yorda did much of the work in fostering affection, but her resulting complacence wore away at that affinity. By giving Trico power and independence, the crucial relationship is built on establishing mutuality. This is also the key to solving each puzzle and overcoming every danger. The discovery of a new solution to a unique challenge furthers the player's comprehension and appreciation for Trico. However, more importantly, it assures the player that Trico reciprocates those feelings. This keeps the emotional drive fresh. Ueda stated that The Last Guardian was a return to his approach of designing a game that he would want to play himself. Indeed, the way it explores his initial concept of developing a relationship between the player and a character feels entirely self-reflective. What evoked that uncanny breadth from the experience was that essential companionship. I believed in the cohesion of The Last Guardian's world because I understood it through my comprehension of Trico. That is the magic behind the game's appeal, and without it, The Last Guardian is a hollow machine. Ueda and his team must have known this, as the game trips over itself to try and ensure the player doesn't become a wrench in its meticulous clockwork. Ultimately, failure is the key to The Last Guardian's magic, but it is also its undoing. The game presents itself with a pristine absence of user interface. The player's indication of an approaching fail state is a cloud of obscuring symbols that begin to drift about the screen. The game cleverly introduces the importance of banishing the symbols by making it the player's first task. Ueda and his team clearly have experience with game design, as the game consistently takes painstaking care to teach the player and prepare them for each new encounter. At the beginning of the game, players find the wounded and aggressive Trico chained to the floor, and are thusly limited to a specific sequence of actions that introduce mechanics one at a time. As the story is told from the boy's perspective in his adulthood, retelling his experience, there is also the convenience of an all-knowing narrator that can provide hints for struggling players. However, despite their best efforts, Ueda and his team perhaps realized that their unconventional approach to Trico's AI could still deter and frustrate players. This is likely the reason that The Last Guardian's unspoiled screen real estate is intruded upon by incessant tooltips. They are placed in areas of interest, not simply to remind players of the controls, but to further convey to the player what they should be doing. As they progress further, the tips only become more intrusive, and they only increase in annoyance when they stack atop one another to explain several possible inputs. Thankfully, they do not tread on the sacred ground of communicating with Trico, but this also means that they only address one small factor causing players to become stuck. The real issue is not this superfluous UI element, but the intrinsic prudence in the game's design. While it was certainly satisfying to reach a puzzle-solving epiphany and appreciate how it built on what the game had already taught, that deliberate gamification treaded dangerously into the realm of predictability. Ueda was faced with the unenviable task of balancing his game's approachability with its integrity. These concessions are frustrating because The Last Guardian is already approachable on the singular condition that players be genuinely willing to engage with Trico. Beyond that step, everything else beautifully falls into place. Without the convenience of spoken dialogue, the team at Gen Design needed to leverage animation to develop the relatability of its characters. The results of what was surely arduous labor is an astounding benchmark in the art of animating. Players must rely on these organic animations to gauge whether the creature is paying attention and if he or she is in the mood to be receptive. The small touches to Trico's expressions, visible in the brow, ears, and posture, all play a crucial role in strengthening the bond with the player in both gameplay and narrative. Trico's movements draw inspiration from several animals. The lithe gait of a cat allows the creature to be relatively articulate even in tight spaces, without defying believability. The more playful animations recall those of a dog's, making the beast more affable. Small details, like Trico's healing horns and wings, as well as his or her mending wounds, lend further weight to the creature's condition. The thundering ferocity Trico exhibits when confronting the stone sentries inspires many of the game's most gratifying moments. By contrast, the boy's animations are charmingly clumsy and delicate. His legs slide about when the player turns around, and his arms flail, barely maintaining his balance. When near a powerful impact, he tumbles and sprawls, little more than a rag doll. His hand will even slip from its purchase on a ledge, leaving him precariously hanging from the other. These animations appropriately feed back to controls, furthering the sense that the boy is not possessed of an inappropriate dexterity. Thankfully, the platforming never requires a degree of precision that could be significantly harmed by this animation priority, especially because the boy automatically clings to ledges and climbable surfaces. This added welcome tackiness to his otherwise slippery control. The barriers to progress in The Last Guardian are cerebral ones. Players need very little digital dexterity to navigate the game, which is why the game's inconsistent performance is also a negligible factor to gameplay. Frame rate mostly takes a hit in lush outdoor areas, which rarely feature puzzles or combat. Ueda has taken a minimalist approach to the stories of his previous games, relying instead on the theming of the interactive portions to drive much of the player's understanding of events. The Last Guardian is no exception, but it also manages to properly distinguish itself from its peers. The hauntingly lush and beautifully desolate environment is an abundant source of mystery. It appropriately recalls the Studio Ghibli classic Castle in the Sky, with mossy stone ruins housing the vivacious glow of cerulean markings, hinting at a magical science that must have once flourished. This same glow decorates the statues, the only discernible antagonists in the game, marking them as an integral part of the environment. Only by investigating and absorbing each new detail of this environment can players have some hope of understanding the larger implications of the plot. The alienating unknown of the setting is counterbalanced by the very relatable bonding of the boy and Trico as they venture forth with the singular purpose of escape. Whereas both Ico and Shadow of the Colossus presented some manner of clear antagonist, the foe of The Last Guardian is much more threatening because it is invisible yet ever present, an animosity that begins to exude from the unmoving rock itself. While it lacks the complexity of its predecessors, The Last Guardian's narrative manages to achieve much of the same emotional impact in both anguish and triumph. As a culmination of his previous endeavors, Fumito Ueda's The Last Guardian is steeped in his most prolific design philosophies, while managing to avoid derivation altogether. A paragon of antiquity that still has fresh ideas. Most significantly, it succeeds where so many other experiences, including Ueda's, have faltered. It gives life to the machine. If only for fleeting moments, the meticulous clockwork can produce a genuine connection between players and artificial intelligence. Some will find it an unrewarding and frustrating process, but it is that same difficulty that makes the relationship real and worthwhile. Every other element, from controls to puzzle design, combat, artwork, and music, is in service to that singular motive. The result is a sublimely transient experience. Tragically, once its limits are discerned and the machine's process is complete, players can never return to that same feeling of vastness, though the connection achingly remains.